Welcome to our session. We're going to be talking about outpacing threats with CrowdStrike, Anthropic, Claude, and Amazon Bedrock. My name is Rob Solomon, Senior Solution Architect at CrowdStrike with the AWS Alliance.
And I am Jen Reed. I'm a Principal Security Solutions Architect with AWS.
My name is Larkin Ryder. I'm the Head of Compliance for Anthropic.
My name is Lucia Stanham. I am a Marketing Manager in charge of all things AI across the CrowdStrike platform.
Generative AI is a very exciting topic. Our imagination and dreams have been preoccupied with AI and generative AI for many years. It extends the reach and capabilities of people, and we're all excited about that. And we're going to talk a little bit about how that impacts security in positive ways. But we're also going to talk about some of the challenges in securing AI, and we have a panel of thought leaders here who will be able to speak to different perspectives about that topic. So we're going to start with talking about the modern threat landscape in general, largely drawing from CrowdStrike's annual global threat report. Then we're going to pivot and focus on AI-specific risks and mitigation. And we're going to talk about the AI-enabled Security Operations Center, largely how we address that at CrowdStrike. And then we're going to pivot to our panel discussion. I think that's going to take most of the session. And then we'll have some Q&A. Thank you. So we usually start our talks with some of these stats from our global threat report just to level set about what the threats look like today. Adversarial threats are becoming more sophisticated. They're moving more and more quickly. And this was happening even before generative AI, but now it is accelerating even more. CrowdStrike has been today tracking 232 different nation-state and e-crime adversaries. So just this past year, in 2023, we've identified 34 additional adversaries. And we understand them in terms of different motivations, different tactics, techniques, and procedures. And this helps give us insight about what they're likely to do next in the environment or which particular industries or segments they're going to go after. One of the really startling details that we keep encountering is that they're not breaking in, they're actually logging in. And we're seeing an increase in dark web access brokers where the e-crime actors are focusing on phishing or compromised passwords, and they sell them on the dark web for other adversaries who are targeting specific companies. So they're able to purchase identity credentials, often of privileged users in the environment. And they take those credentials, they log in, and then they begin to move laterally in the environment. We're going to come back to that in a moment. But they focus increasingly, especially in the last year, not of dropping malware tools, but of using native tools that are part of the operating system. So they're really good at evading detection, at appearing like the attacks themselves are part of normal operations.
And I just have to interject, because this is a panel. It's going to be a conversation. Yeah. We're going to be talking. I'll go out on a limb, jump in, like if you have something you need to contribute. I love a conversation. But the briefings I've heard is not just the risk of third parties harvesting credentials from the dark web and then being able to use the credentials of privileged users to log in, but really at significant levels, at nation state levels, it's turning the insider, right? So you're focused not just on adversaries outside your trust perimeter, but inside your trust perimeter, acting on behalf of another party. And that, to me, is the most devastatingly difficult thing to contend with. So, I have general GRC responsibilities at Anthropic. So I have to look at the threat model, the related risks, and then am I operating a comprehensive system of controls to defend against that insider risk? And it is daunting.
Yeah, and I think that's also really critical because sometimes we think about security from a networking perspective. Yeah. So we know how to instrument and look for behaviors on the wire, right? And we're also looking at it from an endpoint protection perspective, what's actually happening on the machine and in memory. But when you add that extra dimension of identity, that's giving that context of who, when, where, and why are they doing what they're doing, becomes very critical because someone might be a trusted user, but they're logging in at a very strange time of day, right? And they're trying to access a system they probably shouldn't have access to, right? And so that from that perspective, how can you dynamically detect that, respond to it in order to respond to those insider threats, or it could be a credential compromise. Like having that identity threat detection and response capability, especially in the cloud when it comes to generative AI, becomes something that becomes critical so that you can respond adaptively to that.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that's really driving a lot of organizations in their security posture to pursue more of a platform-focused approach that breaks down some of those traditional silos that used to exist from just having an endpoint focus or an identity focus or even a cloud workload and application focus where you need to have that complete visibility. And a lot of these trends are very interrelated. What Rob was saying about speed, attacks continuing to accelerate is in part enabled by factors like the rise in adversaries using credentials or insider threats, because you can have adversaries bypass entire phases of traditional kill chains and continue to start achieving their objectives at much faster paces. So absolutely terrifying.
And I neglected to mention social engineering attacks, and that sort of blends the two, right? You talk a well-meaning support person into resetting your password. It's not exactly an insider threat the way that we think about it, but it's kind of an insider threat. So you're not really sure where that, where the vector of that attack is. So like you were saying, Jen, just really understanding normal patterns of access and authentication are really important. So they are getting faster, as we've been mentioning, and year over year, we're seeing that speed, again, accelerate. So we see here that in 2023, the average breakout time is 62 minutes. Now, what's breakout time? So that first step, that initial access to that, from that compromised credential to some machine, breakout time is from that initial access, moving laterally into the environment to get a foothold, to create persistence in the environment, to start exfiltrating or wreaking havoc in the environment. That's what we call breakout time. And the fastest that we've observed is 2 minutes and 7 seconds. So there's really no time to react. You really need to have those systems that not only automatically stop the attack, but can prepare a security and incident response team to act quickly.
And you don't have the metric here for the average time to detect a compromise on your network, but back when I was looking at that metric, it was on the order of months. Like, it's a ridiculous discrepancy between the time to be effective as an attacker and the time to be effective as a defender. And how do we close that gap?
That's a great point. I think we're going to start including that metric, or I am in my presentation.
Okay, there you go.
So securing cloud environments is critical. We're seeing the attackers become increasingly cloud savvy. So understanding how to accelerate the attack in the cloud environment, how to use cloud resources specifically, and how to exploit them, as opposed to in the past, attacks were more cloud agnostic, just really attacking resources, not necessarily knowing where they are or taking advantage. So we're seeing an acceleration there. And finally, and here's where we start to get into the meat of this conversation, generative AI is presenting new security challenges where, yes, generative AI is helping security practitioners in companies like CrowdStrike and AWS and Anthropic, but The adversaries are also using generative AI to democratize these sophisticated attacks where you don't really have to have all of that knowledge. You're able to leverage generative AI to help you think of new ways to accelerate those attacks.
And what I think is really important is that generative AI is not occurring in a vacuum. It's actually part of a broader application. So we traditionally think in the upper right-hand category is our application security component. So when we're normally, from that perspective, we look at OWASP top 10, and we're always talking to our developers about how we improve the application. What generative AI has done, though, is because data and the models become so monetarily valuable, we've now expanded that plane with the OWASP top 10 for large language models and started to bring in additional personas that you need to think about. And in the cloud or in an enterprise, like those personas, whether it's your data engineer, your platform engineer, your cloud engineer, your data scientist, your risk manager, all of those are different personas with different amounts of privilege and access to do certain things, and if you do it right. And so at AWS, we have Amazon verified permissions that help you to be able to specify what those levels of permission are. But at the same time, you can't get away from doing the threat modeling. So just as you would have to do a threat model on your typical application, generative AI is a more complex resource that you're bringing into play, but it's still a resource. So your data flows and your application flows and the permissions and understanding that just doesn't go away. And so when we're thinking about that, we need to think about that bigger picture and keep it in mind, because it's not just the browser app, though that's important. Don't get me wrong, if your employees are using things on the browser, but when you're thinking about enterprise applications, I mean, it's important to think about that broader picture. I mean, at Anthropic, how do you look at that, Larkin?
Yeah, I mean, the whole side of that, what's your word? The left side.
the left and bottom.
Side. I spend a lot of time threat modeling on the left side of this diagram, right? Because what we want to do at Anthropic is manage for our customers all the parts of the threat model that apply to that data pipeline that we can, right? And so we're very selective with the data sources that we're using in order to build the model. We're doing our own careful sanitization process. We want to remove the PII from that information that we're collecting from public data sources. Yes, you have needs about Tom Cruise. You need to be able to use a model to inquire about what he's up to these days. And we want you to be able to do that. But my neighbor, who also happens to be named Tom Cruise, none of your business, right? So we have to focus on that kind of problem when we're securing the data that builds our model. But the supply chain is one of the most important areas for us. That is an area where we are seeing increased threats. So if I look back across my whole career, I've been doing this for 20 years, right? And when I started, the attack beachhead was always the laptop. It was always it wasn't even the laptop because we weren't even using laptops. It was the desktop. And you had to worry more than anything else about malware getting into that environment. And your ability to patch those remote desktops efficiently, keep them up to date, the browsers especially, and then we weren't even thinking about monitoring on the desktop in those days. Startling to think about, but that was the case we were in. Okay, so that was the main foothold. Then that kind of transitioned over time to stolen credentials, right? Stolen credentials became that was the big area. Now what I'm hearing from the sources that we get our threat intelligence from is it's zero-day exploits that are becoming, and I think this goes to the stat you had earlier about cloud aware, cloud native, right? The ability to understand the networking stacks in those cloud environments and the CVEs against those and using those as an entry point and a pivot point. It's fascinating stuff. We have to worry about all of that in our environment to make sure that and then increasingly, I guess I was going to say, I think the next wave is going to be that third-party supply chain as the way that compromises happen in each of our environments. And so looking at our development chain, looking at the way we integrate, open source code, looking at our vendors and making sure that we have control of every single piece of the puzzle that's coming into our trust boundary, especially in that CI/CD area. It's you could spend, as a security team, you could spend all your time there.
Yeah, we can't automatically trust the controls of our suppliers. We don't know that there is not some vector for malware or backdoors, et cetera, to enter them, and then we make them part of our software, and that can be a problem. You just mentioned zero-day attacks as a challenge, and something that I didn't have down here is that 75% of the attacks that we're seeing are malware-free. They're interactive attacks. So there's an actual human being on the other side able to adapt in real time to what they're encountering in the environment. So that whole old model, as you were saying, of if you can protect your desktop from a malware attack, you're fine. It's not that long ago. A lot of us are still thinking that. That is just not the main concern these days. It's still a concern, but it is relatively small now.
And that puts a lot of weight on how we use technologies such as AI in advancing detection, especially operating proactively with behavioral analysis and making sure that we can detect at first instance, once there's a 0-day, if there is an exploit and what the solution has to be. And that's where AI can be especially important as well for accelerating our response in those moments.
Should we proceed?
Yeah. And so when we're thinking about that overall large stack, which is normally what you might think about from a complex environment for which I'm creating generative AI, there is a shared responsibility between, for us from AWS perspective, for providing you the security of the cloud, but at the same time, with your generative AI vendors, they have a shared responsibility, which Larkin has spoken about from her perspective of how she provides you with that data. Well, at AWS, we try really hard to provide you with the tools to create secure generative AI applications in the cloud, but it's really important for you to understand how to properly do that. And so with that, we provide you capabilities that within the network and application infrastructure. So think about VPCs and deploying those VPC endpoints in order to keep a lot of the data flows inside of that VPC, as well as encryption, providing the capabilities to do authentication and authorization, leveraging SSO where appropriate with Identity Center, specifying permissions with Identity Center or Amazon Verified permissions for zero trust. And then you have all of their capabilities for data protection, so KMS keys, so you can either do those customer-provided keys. We have HSM capabilities, but all these enable you to take advantage of doing encryption in rest as well as encryption in transit. And then we do have, and this is the thing that I think is really important, we have security partners like CrowdStrike, because we can provide you with all of these capabilities in our enterprise security services like Security Hub and Amazon Security Lake. But we have partners who are really good at providing that point of view for the security analyst, the SOC, the incident responder, to help understand that instrumentation inside of AWS and outside of AWS to create that enterprise view, right? Which can be really helpful to vendors that we partner with to provide these capabilities, but also to our end customers. And what I really love about the partnership is that together, working with CrowdStrike, we can help our customers deploy solutions in their environment rapidly, but also ensure they meet their compliance reporting requirements, and to meet HIPAA or SOC or PCI. And so I think it's really exciting times for that. And our broader partner community with vendor insights, we were talking about supply chain, you have the ability to see what their compliance, their continuous compliance is within the marketplace. So from a shortcutting perspective, trying to figure out, well, where is this vendor at as far as SOC 2 or PCI? Do they have HIPAA? You can leverage that in the marketplace to get that information, trying to speed that time to purchase. So it makes me really excited about what we can do to help security professionals like all of you to really take advantage of that, to build faster, to let security be the enabler of innovation instead of a border that must be crossed. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, just one takeaway from what you were saying. I think it's important to remember, one, if you're securing your generative AI application, you also are securing your pipelines, your applications, your whole infrastructure, your access model. Everything is required in that defense in depth approach. And there's really not a lot of time to figure it out, and certainly no time to deploy and then figure out your strategy. It needs to be baked in from the outset and automated so that as you grow inside of AWS, your security is automatically deploying and covering everything. Because again, the adversaries are not waiting for you to catch up. They're watching for you to make a misstep, I think is important.
All right, so just the other side of the coin of securing AI is how we can use AI in security. And this really is where we think about a framework in security many of you are probably familiar with, known as the OODA loop. So how do we enable analysts to observe something, orient, decide, and then act, and to go through that cycle as efficiently and as quickly and accurately as possible. And at every single one of these stages, what we have seen with CrowdStrike is that there have been, especially over the last 15 years in the industry, AI and machine learning have really enabled defenders to take every single stage to the next level. So when we talk about advancing detections, it means how do we make sure that we are correlating the right observed environment telemetry with threat intelligence, with everything we know from behavioral analysis as well, and giving defenders higher fidelity detections. Burnout is a very real issue that I'm seeing heads nod already. This is hitting a sore point. More detections is not better. It's truly detection efficacy and fidelity is the holy grail. And so making sure that we are not flooding analysts with everything and anything, and really just what they need to focus on is one of the ways that we first started seeing AI really start helping. The next is by giving analysts that richer threat context, and that's where consolidation and that integration of this is what's happening on your endpoints, this is what your different identities are doing, and then how does this correlate with different environments like any cloud or apps that they're working on. That integrated view and then enriched with threat intelligence really helps you see your environment through the eyes of the adversary. And that is something very few platforms can truly provide because it requires that integration and that data normalization to be able to understand all of these different layers of behavior, of environment telemetry. And then we move into more recent phases of AI development that have really helped analysts take it to the next level, which is in how we use AI to accelerate investigations and even response. And then that's where automation can also take things to the next level. But that's where we're really seeing a lot of AI-fueled assistance. So helping analysts triage, automating a lot of the manual workflows that they have, answering their questions on the fly, and really giving them the information they need to decide and then ultimately act as quickly as possible. So that's at a high level how we have been starting to see how AI is helping analysts start to reclaim that speed advantage against adversaries. But one of the ways that we have most recently been, especially capitalizing on generative AI, the most recent wave in a lot of these innovations is through CrowdStrike's conversational AI assistant, which is Charlotte AI. And we'll talk about that and even show a quick demo on that.
I have to make a commentary, though, on why the security job is so hard, because this is something I can't, like I'm standing in line, picking up my badge at the beginning of the conference, and I get into a conversation about why security is so hard. And I think it comes down to three things. One, it's a doomsday cult. We're all just sitting here waiting for the worst thing. We're waiting for the end of the world. It's our bad day for our company that is career ending for us or enterprise ending for the company that we're part of. It's the infinite backlog. Your job is never done. You never ship your product, right? You never get to move on to the next thing. You're always there fighting for the next level of security that you have to put in place because the adversaries aren't standing still either. And then the last one is this very issue. It is the I'm always on call, there is always going to be an alert. And so reducing the noise on that last one, you can't do anything about the first two, but that last one, that is the problem that you can manage.
Yeah, and I think even before Charlotte, the fact that CrowdStrike can take in a whole bunch of findings across your cloud platform and your endpoints, servers, endpoint laptops, and tell you whether or not that CVE that is a high, is it really a high? Is it really a 9? Is it exploitable? Because if I have to go have a conversation with the head of engineering about we've got to do this, but they'll have to do regression testing on the 4 branches already in development, and is it going to be? Do I have to have that conversation?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many people had to make that decision.
It's Log4j. The holidays are canceled.
It's
terrible. Yeah.
And then when it's not exploitable, but no, we have to take care of it. But I promise you it's not exploitable. Nothing is using it. Having those conversations, because every time you make a call, because before I came to AWS, I was also a CISO. And so your job is to figure out how to balance risk. And so risk isn't fixed. So everything has to be in context. And so is Log4j exploitable? Even if it's on the server, is it? Yeah. And sometimes the answer is no. Right. It absolutely is not. And so then it's like, I don't need to worry about that one right now. At some point, I'm going to ask them to roll the new infrastructure image that the dev team's going to build off of that'll have it removed. But in that normal life cycle of infrastructure updates, right, that's coming either 30 days or 60 days, depending on.
Yep.
So then you can make that decision.
Yeah, moving from the reactive motion to the proactive motion for as much of the work as you have to do.
Yeah, and so like from just being able to see that, it's like, oh no, this 9, which is actually a critical, it's actually a low because of where it's sitting, because you're able to like integrate all of those different detections to be able to using AI to figure out where that actually sits within your enterprise. It's like, one of the things that I hear from a lot of our AWS customers that use CrowdStrike is the thing that they find most valuable, just to understand when I have to go to operations or to apps to have that conversation, actually help them understand the context.
So we're never going to eliminate all risk.
No.
Right? That is that doomsday scenario.
Yeah.
So yes, we have to reprioritize based upon that contextual understanding of the likelihood that any particular problem is going to be a problem. And yes, as you pointed out, just taking the fixed CVE severity at face value, you're going to be chasing that stuff forever. Right? You've got to reassess, as we do with Expert AI. We take into consideration the context, the attack path. Is this exploitable in this context? And that greatly reduces that sense of constant urgency that doesn't let security professionals take a break.
And for those who may not be as familiar with the Falcon platform, Rob just mentioned Expert AI is, in addition to the CVSS score that you'll see in the Falcon platform for a given vulnerability, CrowdStrike also uses a lot of our threat intelligence and, as Jen mentioned, attack paths and everything we know about vulnerabilities to create its own machine learning-based vulnerability prioritization, and its own severity model as well. So that's something that our users get as part of the additional context in addition to what is published in the industry that really helps add that extra context. As we mentioned, Charlotte AI is CrowdStrike's conversational AI assistant. One of the problems I'll add to what Larkin mentioned that is a persistent plague for security teams is that in the face of this increasingly aggressive threat landscape, many teams are fighting with one of their hands tied behind their backs. I heard a stat that around 80% of organizations are understaffed and suffering from skills shortages. Great security experts are hard to find, they're hard to train, they're hard to retain. And so in the face of this, one of the big conversations we've been having with organizations is how can you take these already lean teams, many of whom are on the verge of burnout, and help them do much more, much faster, and ideally more of the things that they actually enjoy doing, and cutting out many of those manual and repetitive workflows. And that has been at the heart of what we have seen driving a lot of the adoption of Charlotte AI, which sits across the Falcon platform and helps organizations and analysts use plain language conversations and questions to interrogate their underlying Falcon data, as we'll see in the demo. But this is just as helpful whether you are an expert that's incredibly seasoned in the platform and is looking for an easy button to just gain that extra edge. But it's also just as easy for novices who are asking those early questions or fumbling through how to write that query. And that can be something where we have seen generative AI really slices and compresses workflows, sometimes as extremely as taking hours of work and turning it into just minutes or seconds. And I don't know, Jen, from your perspective as a former CISO, if someone had asked you, what would you do? How much would you pay to make your team 10% faster or 20% faster? I feel like that's a willing investment.
100%. I mean, so it's one of the things is that we have a lot of college graduates who graduate with cybersecurity degrees, and they're looking for that first job. And the big problem with that is that we expect a lot out of our SOC analysts and out of our security analysts. So if you ever look at a job posting, you're like, how is that entry level, right? And so it is like a CISO, you want to give that person that opportunity, but you also need them to be able to do more. And so being able to open the door to provide that opportunity to those recent grads or people coming out of the military who want to enter cybersecurity, to give them that assistant so that they can start doing that work becomes invaluable because I can never hire enough people ever.
Yep.
And also it's like every time I want to hire someone, that is a software developer that engineering cannot hire. Because the business has a limited number of resources. So it's like you're having that conversation, with the head of products, the chief product officer. Can I have a head count? And so that becomes that continuous conversation. And so how can I open up that avenue for bringing that talent in and getting them leveled up, right? Because we have graduates. So when you go to RSA or you go to job fairs, they're like, I'm graduating with a cybersecurity degree. How do I get started? It's a fantastic opportunity to leverage that capability.
So this is what I was referring to, expanding the capabilities of our security team. So we're accelerating the speed, effectiveness, efficiency of experienced practitioners, but also providing training wheels for entry level, right, to get them up to speed more quickly.
Yeah.
Awesome. So just to change it up a little bit, we have a quick demo that I'll talk through, just as you can see a typical workflow that an analyst will use with Charlotte AI. All right, so if you can imagine here, we're starting our day in the Falcon platform and we start looking at a list of detections. So right off the bat, if we click into one of them, what we see is that the Falcon platform's detection engineering has flagged a suspicious command line for us to investigate. Now, that same command line is in the investigations panel that you see on the right. But as an analyst, sometimes I may come across languages in scripts or commands that I'm not familiar with. So that delays my ability to make a decision. So here we have an embedded capability of Charlotte AI outside of our module. And what I'm going to do is click on that. And this is a great example of how Charlotte AI helps me get the context that I need. So it's going to read this command line and translate it in plain language for me. So it creates this step-by-step breakdown of what this script is intended to do. And in plain language tells me that this also has a few indicators that it has detected across the platform for us to investigate. Now what I'll do next, just because I want to ask some follow-up questions, is I'm going to go into the Charlotte AI module in the platform, and I'm going to continue my investigation. So because this is all integrated, I can find the same query now in my conversation history, and because we have a little bit more space, we see those two indicators actually broken out. The second one you see is an IP address. So we'll go into it further. What we're going to ask Charlotte AI is to search for connections to this specific IP address. And I'm going to use plain language references to information in the prior one. And Charlotte AI is going to have that conversational context to know that when I say this IP address or this address, it's going to have the context from the prior information, and I don't need to repeat myself or rewrite specific indicators. And it's going to do all of this in seconds. And under the hood, it's using many of the industry's cutting-edge large language models, such as what we have, thankfully, from the Claude family and the Claude portfolio. So here, what we have is a query in one of CrowdStrike's query languages known as LogScale that will enable me to search for this. So I didn't need to know how to write the specific query. And here it gives me the option to even run that exact query in CrowdStrike's advanced event search. So here, it's already pasted it and run it for me on my behalf. I didn't have to copy, save it, rewrite it, or anything. And then one of the other things that we can do is start taking action. So one of the things that we'll do is use CrowdStrike's real-time response capabilities. And I'll ask it to write me another script. In this case, perhaps to quarantine hosts with connections to this particular address. And what this will do is seal off, I want it to seal off ports except the one, of course, to the Falcon agent, just to make sure that we can mitigate some of the damage. And as you can see, I'm using plain language, the same I would talk to someone next to me in the SOC. So right off the bat, it prompts me with a warning as well. This is one of our responsible AI safeguards that we have baked in that elevates and warns analysts that everything we do has to be reviewed, directed, and authorized by an analyst. And then it gives us a PowerShell script, and this essentially takes our request and translates it into a script that will search for hosts with connections to this address and author 2 rules that block inbound and outbound traffic to this host respectively. And the last thing we'll do, going back to the topic of vulnerabilities, is look at the host name, and we're going to ask CrowdStrike to search for vulnerabilities on this host that could be potential exploitable entry points that an adversary might exploit. So I'll search for this. Again, plain language, give me vulnerabilities on this host. Now it's important to know, I can do all of this with the Falcon platform. I don't need Charlotte AI to have access to any of this information. But what it enables me to do is do all of this in a matter of seconds. This was all recorded in real time. And so here it has queried CrowdStrike's modules for vulnerabilities and presented a table for me with information from that, with fields it has deemed relevant, such as its CVSS level and expert AI rating. And what you can see here is one of my favorite features, which is another responsible AI principle that we have implemented, which is that every answer is queryable and inspectable. So by clicking on that, you can see how Charlotte AI interpreted my request, turned that into an API request for the platform, and where it went across my different modules to inspect that. And that has 2 key advantages. One, as an analyst, I am reviewing and inspecting, did Charlotte AI interpret my request correctly? Did it go to the right place for the information across my modules? But it's also a really great teaching resource. If I'm new to the platform and didn't know how to use this particular tool or where I would need to go, and I don't want to spend time navigating through the console or scanning through documentation, I can just ask Charlotte AI and I can then learn where it would go. So in the future, if I wanted to recreate the analysis by myself, without Charlotte AI, I could do that as well. But end to end, as you can see, I've gone through 3 or 4 different steps in less than 3 minutes, end to end. And that speed advantage is what we have seen is the greatest appeal of generative AI adoption for SOC analysts especially.
Thank you, very impressive.
Yeah, very nice.
So I would say that we're going to pivot to the panel discussion, but I feel like that happened already. So let's sort of dive into the middle of this conversation. I started talking about CrowdStrike's global threat report, some of how we're observing the current threat landscape. We've discussed a little bit about how Anthropic and AWS as well are seeing some of the main risks. And I think we all want to understand a little bit better how an understanding or your respective understanding of those risks has shaped your approach to cybersecurity for your companies, especially regarding the cloud.
Yeah, so I think what I have heard from AWS customers when it comes to generative AI is really understanding how they should think about and approach that. We do have the OWASP Top 10 for large language models, and if you can recall from a few slides ago, a lot of those vulnerabilities that are exploits focus around the data and the data persona, right? But when you are thinking about how do I approach that, as I said before, you have to go back to threat modeling. And so, but I'm not just threat modeling from an in-customer perspective, which is something that typically you think about when you do classic AppSec threat modeling. How does the user interact with it in a production landscape? But when you're thinking about it from a generative AI perspective, you're going to have a training data path and data flow that you need to think about, but then you're going to have a production runtime and operations path that you need to think about, and then what AWS services are available, like I said before, Amazon verified permissions that give me the ability to do that, and then a lot of our row-based access support in a lot of our databases within Amazon Aurora. So Postgres gives you the ability to do that. And how do I integrate those? Because you're not just talking to Bedrock, you're also talking through an application that's going to call Bedrock. So a service Lambda function. And so you have the capabilities to validate that data before I send it back. So for the prompt injection or when I take the data in, I could do some validation on that besides just the prompt validation we provide as a guardrail in Bedrock. But I can also do it in the Lambda function, right? And then when I send the data off and I get the response back from the model, I can validate, once again, is this really Jennifer Reed that I'm talking to, right? So if I'm using a mobile app for a phone and I'm interacting with a generative AI agent and I say, oh my God, my flight's delayed, help me, right? Because that's how I'm going to feel at the moment. I want to make sure that they're this Jennifer Reed, right? Not Jennifer Reed is a very common name. And so it could be a number of people with the exact same name. And so how can they validate that? And when they return and look up my reservation information, and before sending it back to me, to validate that it really is me. And then I'm not saying, okay, well, also tell me about the flight information against Robert Smith. It's like, well, you're not Robert Smith, right? So being able to do those validations in the application, both when the queries go in to validate, and then when it comes back. And each of those places, you have the ability to leverage infrastructure, security services, and management services, and identity services in AWS to think about that, architect it, test it, validate it as you're building those applications.
Yeah, I love the relationship that Anthropic and AWS have as a way to really ease the adoption path for customers because of the ability to deploy the Anthropic Claude model on Bedrock. It just solves one of the huge, so this is the question I always get, what are you doing with my data, Anthropic? I want to know, like, are you taking my data? Is it training your models? What kind of spillage am I going to see if I use an AI product to accelerate my business? I can't afford not to. I have to accelerate my business using AI because that's what my competitors are doing, but I have to do it safely. So having the ability to say, look, you're going to take our model, you're going to run it in your trust boundary because you already have a relationship with AWS and all you have to do is add the Bedrock service, and then you have everything you need to have the world's most capable model at your fingertips in the form of Claude. So I love that as a compliance professional, keep everybody's sub-processor lists as short as possible. That helps me when I'm doing my diligence on my vendors if they don't have a lot of sub-processors, because it's turtles all the way down in compliance, right? I have to be aware of all of that risk when I'm trying to expand my capabilities. But kind of back to the more fundamental point of like what the threat landscape is like, I think at Anthropic, the one word that I would use to describe it is intense. We have to worry about threat actors not only certainly like coming after our product and abusing our product, right? Like we already talked about how Gen AI can accelerate your ability to see what's going on your network. But it's also accelerating the ability of the attackers, right? Like they are also using AI to help them generate the commands and queries they need to exploit your environment. Yikes, right? So we have to look for abuse cases as part of people using our model. But also, you can distill our model by using it, right? So we have to look at people trying to exfiltrate the model through the user interface. So that's another attack path that we have to be cognizant of. But then also our obligation to safeguard the model so that it cannot be misused by someone just taking the model themselves and retraining it. That's our biggest concern, right? Because in the state in which we have deployed our model, we have trained it, we have fine-tuned it to meet the objectives of being honest, harmless, and helpful. And that harmlessness could be trained out of it by someone who is able to steal the model and stand up their own training environment for fine-tuning it. We are obviously, very much committed to our relationship with AWS also for how we train the model. But those are resources increasingly available more broadly. And certainly if you can stand up the right fine-tuning environment, you can put yourself in a position where you can augment a model that you've stolen for a very nefarious purpose. Mm-hmm. So safeguarding the integrity of that information is one of the reasons we use CrowdStrike as a critical part of our security program.
You were just talking about customer concerns about data spillage. So just to clarify, what happens to customer data? How is customer data protected for a customer who uses a Claude model on AWS?
Yeah, it's a great question. So first of all, with regards to how we train the models in general, we're using data that's publicly available on the internet. We're using data that we've acquired under specific contracts. From time to time, our customers may give us permission to use their information, but we would not ever use any customer data as part of training the model. If you are using our first-party product, not on AWS, again, we're not retaining your data beyond a certain limited period and only as part of providing the product to you. And we're certainly not using the data in any way without your permission. You can read in more detail on our web pages about what our retention policies are for that information, but we're not using it. We're not taking it for our own purposes beyond the ways we have to interact with it in order to serve the product. And that's all laid out very clearly, I think, in our privacy policy and related documentation. And if you have any questions about that, please engage with our sales and support organization. They'd love to walk you through it. Absolutely no problem. But with Bedrock, we have no capability to get into that trust boundary. We cannot reach into your VPC and interact with your data in that environment. So you have just that extra level of protection just in the form of that. And for some of our customers who are more legitimately paranoid and highly regulated, it's just simply a requirement for them to be operating in that environment when I was head of product security at Slack, that is why I chose Anthropic. My team chose Anthropic as the right resource for Slack to use, because the Slack product is FedRAMP moderate, and therefore the trust boundary is sacrosanct. So they had to work with Bedrock deployment.
Thank you for that clarification.
You bet.
So we're all talking about generative AI for the past year or two. We're all obsessed with this. And generative AI, you mentioned companies are concerned about using generative AI-enabled applications, and they're concerned about not using them. So in a way, it's become all things to all people. So what are some of the misconceptions that are floating around there that maybe you can help dispel for us?
Yeah, I think the biggest misconception is around the data handling, which I think I've talked to quite a bit. I think another misconception, I think there are definitely concerns with things like how easy it is to jailbreak an AI, and that because it's just English and I know English, I can convince the AI to do something that it's trained to not do, to return information that would be harmful, right? So we are safeguarding not only the model in our care, but we're safeguarding the experience that users have with the model by putting jailbreak mitigations into our training process, right? We use something called constitutional AI, and this is a data set that's designed to align the final AI with human values. So we use things like the Declaration on Human Rights from the UN, which is really a representation of the fact that we all deserve privacy, we all deserve to be treated fairly, without bias, free from harm. All of those things are human values, and we represent that into the model. Part of the result of that is that it's harder to talk the model into giving you information that will help you perpetuate a cybersecurity attack against critical infrastructure, get information that would let you, build a bioweapon, et cetera. But it also serves to make the model more jailbreak resistant. So I think the Claude benchmarks we run show that it's about 10 times more jailbreak resistant than other large language models that are available today. So that is one of the services that we're providing you in how we design the model. So I know that is one of the key concerns. Another key concern is hallucination. We also evaluate ourselves very closely and continue to do fundamental research. We're not just a company that's here to build large language models. The basic premise of the existence of Anthropic is AI safety and research around AI safety and making hallucinations a focus, understanding more about how models operate. We publish a ton of research. Please check out our website. It's great. So studying things that create big words like monosemanticity, like that is part of what we're doing. Understanding those things better about how the model is making decisions for some definition of decisions, that helps us manage things like hallucinations as well. There's work to do, but it's getting better at an incredible rate.
I think for one of the things, I think there's two things that I think are very big misperceptions, or things that people think are hard. And so the first is that all the data is biased, and so therefore the data cannot be trusted or used. Yeah. And I think that has more to do with the application design and the governance processes that you should be putting in at the beginning. Yes. And a lot of this, I like to think of it as software development or software product management 101. And so what is the next app I'm creating, right? So what industry is it for? Who is the persona of the person that's going to use it? And what kind of data am I going to feed? Does it look like that person, right? So what are the different demographics? And is there anyone on my governance team to do validation, to look for hallucinations, or to understand is the recommendation structured in a way that's going to be appropriate for the different audiences that are going to interact with it? And if you don't have anyone on your team that looks like those demographics, then as you're looking for VC funding, you should really also make sure that you're hiring or working with consultants that meet those demographics that can help you with the validation processes to really understand that, because these are solvable problems, but they're not if you don't think about them at the beginning. Right?
Yeah, no, it's such a great point. Thank you for making it especially about bias. And the more you fine tune a model to your particular use cases, and AWS and Anthropic have partnered with services that are here to help you with your full deployment process, including making sure whatever the prompts are that you're putting in and the outputs you get out are optimized through a certain amount of tuning, additional data. You may need to build a data pipeline to put more context around everything that you're asking the model to do, which is incredibly valuable because it makes the results faster to you and cheaper to you to do that fine tuning. So be sure you're thinking through your use cases and putting the tuning you need into your development process to make sure you're getting out what you put in, and you're going to have so much of a better experience, way fewer hallucinations, way fewer, and way less biased.
100%.
So I have one final question that I'd like to put out there. The rate of innovation of generative AI in general is far outpacing the state and federal government's ability to effectively regulate, and we're seeing a lot of that in the news today. Can you speak to, you were talking before about constitutional AI, and we're talking about responsible use of AI, and we appreciate that you are taking that upon yourself to do. But what other ways are you addressing this mismatch?
Yeah, we know we can't wait for regulation, and as I indicated before, Anthropic was founded on the idea that this level of research is necessary, and we needed to build and fund a Gen AI company in order to get ahead of that risk. So we've worked with experts to define a set of what we call ASLs, and these are safety levels for AI. That are aligned to the CDC biosafety levels, and we are committed to monitoring continuously the risks associated with the capabilities of the AIs that we've developed so far, and making sure if we can't provide a safe deployment and secure operating environment for the model at that level of capability, that we don't progress. And this is all under the auspices of our responsible scaling policy. And I'm going to just leave my explanation there because we're so close to being out of time. I can't believe this
really flew by. I'd like to call out, we publish a series called Conversations with Charlotte AI, online short videos for you to see other capabilities of Charlotte AI, as well as CrowdStrike's cloud security health check, something that we run in tandem with AWS. If you are curious about the level of risk in your cloud environments and you'd like a quick assessment, we offer $1,000 AWS service credit for you to go through our cloud security posture management assessment, very lightweight. But please, if you haven't already, take a picture of the QR codes and you can follow up after the fact. And of course, the global threat report that I mentioned, that comes out on an annual basis.
Yes. And thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming.